With the introduction of the Dendro element, it not only brought a swath of brand new elemental reactions to mess around with, but it's also upticked the usefulness of several other units and shaken up how we build our teams going forward, just due to how strong it actually is. And this is largely due to just how adaptable the Dendro element is and how many reactions it can actually do, because pretty much every element in the game in one way or another has received some sort of interaction with Dendro, minus Geo, unfortunately. And if you want to know more about those reactions and those interactions with some of the other elements, you should check out our previous video talking about all of those Dendro reactions. But today we're going to be going over every single character that has received a buff from the introduction of Dendro in one way or another. And what I mean by this is, well, we're not going to just say like, oh, the character's pyro and now they can do the burning and virgin reaction, so they got a buff. No, we're going to be talking about characters who I think their kit has been personally enhanced by the way Dendro works on a fundamental level. And what I mean by this is probably a good example right here in front of you is Yae Miko. Just as a quick spoiler, she'll be on the list. And she scales with Elemental Mastery and always has, and Elemental Mastery scales really well with all of the Dendro reactions, so she has received a direct buff in some way. There's a couple other things that she has going for her that has really received a buff due to the way Dendro works, but that's just one example there, and we're going to be talking about all of those kinds of characters. We have a lot of different characters to cover, but maybe I didn't cover one that you've been really enjoying with those Dendro reactions, and if you don't notice them on this list, feel free to list them down in the comment section below and let me know how you've been enjoying them with the Dendro element. But for now, let's go ahead and talk about the characters that have received an awesome buff from Dendro. First off, we'll continue with Yae Miko that I was mentioning earlier. And as I said, she scales with Elemental Mastery. Her damage on her E skill scales with Elemental Mastery. Every point gets extra damage for her E skill there, and that's fantastic. But not only is she getting that extra damage from her Elemental Mastery, that Elemental Mastery is going to be contributing to the high scaling Dendro reactions that we've obtained, like Hyper Bloom and the brand new amplifying reaction of Aggravate, which is the only amplifying reaction for Electro, meaning Electro as a whole has gotten a buff. There's going to be a lot of Electro characters on here, by the way, spoiler, but yeah, Electro has received a huge increase here due to the fact that it now has an amplifying reaction, and the Elemental Mastery scaling has become extremely valuable on Electro characters. But she also has one aspect to her in her Elemental Burst to where this can hit several times, and if you have all three of your turrets, it's going to hit 4 times, I believe. And the nice part about that is one of these hits on your Elemental Burst are going to cause the quicken reaction if you have Dendro applied, and then 1 or 2 of the others are going to be able to aggravate and get that amplifying bonus, which they wouldn't have previously. So now they're just going to be dealing more damage, and these were already dealing really considerable damage in the first place, so this Elemental Burst just got a lot stronger. Next up, we'll talk about a character you've probably heard of by now in their interaction with Dendro, that being Fischl. She's very similar to Yae as an off-field electro damage dealer and applier there. However, Fischl has a very unique aspect to her when it comes to these Dendro reactions specifically. So not only does she have the typical Oz business that goes down where she's very good at applying her electro and generating particles for the team, however, her passive here is ridiculous with Dendro, because for those of you who don't know, this passive that Fischl has, that whenever you create an electro related elemental reaction while Oz is on the field, you're going to get this thundering retribution effect dealing electro damage equal to 80% of Fischl's attack. But what you might not know about this specific passive is that it has no internal cooldown. So basically, as fast as you can proc reactions is as fast as this will activate. So if you haven't put 2 and 2 together yet, whenever you cause the quicken reaction with anybody, this passive is going to activate and deal its damage for aggravate. So you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait on any internal cooldown or anything. You're always going to be aggravating the moment you quicken. And although the damage on this isn't insane or anything, being able to aggravate that quickly and that consistently is incredibly strong, because as I said, that is our only electro amplifying reaction, and it is allowing them to really pop off in terms of damage. So this is incredible. Fischl has really jutted up to an SS tier type character, similar to somebody like Kazuha, because this passive is just actually that nuts. She was already a phenomenal character before, but now with that interaction with Quicken and Aggravate, she's really bumped herself to be a phenomenal character. Next up is another Electro character, and that is Kuki Shinobu. Don't worry, I'm going to break it up with some of the other elements here as we go along. But yeah, you probably should have seen this one coming, because Kuki Shinobu was our first Electro healer, and she happened to scale with Elemental Mastery. And when she came out, I didn't think that was an accident, and it certainly wasn't. Kuki Shinobu also has this unique aspect to her where she's probably the best character for Hyper Bloom. And what I mean by that is, well, of course we do know, let's just reiterate, that Kuki Shinobu scales off of max HP. As we all know, she gets damage from her max HP here and her healing from her max HP here. However, the damage on her skill doesn't actually scale from max HP, just clarify there. But she does get damage modifiers from her Elemental Mastery and healing modifiers from her Elemental Mastery. So although she's HP scaling, Elemental Mastery has always been fantastic on her, and I went over this in my Kuki Shinobu build guide, because the Elemental Mastery healing really wasn't that far behind the HP healing, and the damage you got off of Electro Charge and Overload previously really made up for her lack of damage elsewhere. So I was on the train that Elemental Mastery was better anyway, but now that Dendro's out, it is definitely better. It allows her to deal some really solid damage on all of those different Dendro related reactions, especially one like Hyper Bloom. And for Hyper Bloom specifically, she's very good because of her elemental skill is a wide radius of what it affects. It deals a radius of Electro, and if you have a bunch of those Dendro cores from the Bloom reaction lying around, it's going to hit all of them and make all of them be heat-seeking missiles and hit your different enemies. So that's awesome. It's super strong right there. And then she also has this elemental burst that does multiple procs of Electro Aura during the elemental burst duration there. So it's going to be able to activate Quicken, Aggravate, whatever, Hyper Bloom, if you got any cores on the ground. It's going to be able to do all of that during that duration, and most of that is going to be scaling with your Elemental Mastery. Of course, Aggravate isn't going to be nearly as strong with her because she isn't a crit rate, crit damage oriented type of healer, but regardless, it's still going to be pretty darn good because of the way that you're going to want to build her with Elemental Mastery. And as I said, she is certainly the best Hyper Bloom oriented character. If you were trying to do Hyper Bloom, she's phenomenal because the ticks of intermittent Electro application in a small radius are just, slow enough or have wide enough a gap to allow you to set up those Dendro cores to then activate them and pop off. Alright, next up is Thoma. Thoma's received a buff in a couple of ways, and one of these is actually going to be the brand new artifact set, which is the Gilded Dream set, where it buffs Elemental Mastery and it buffs Elemental Mastery and attack of other characters based on whatever elements you have and whatnot. It's a pretty good set overall, but the importance of this set is that it can buff Elemental Mastery, buff attack, and also the fact that Thoma didn't really have a 4-piece set you wanted to use before. You were mostly just using 2 pieces of other different sets, and this is probably the only 4-piece set that really applies to them, especially since he can do this while he's off of the field, which is very important, so he can buff your team in that way now, which is absolutely phenomenal. But not only that, Thoma is probably going to be one of your best Burgeon teammates. If you are doing some sort of Bloom team and you want a Burgeon, Thoma is phenomenal for it. Not only because of the fact that Thoma is going to protect you from your own Burgeon damage, because keep in mind, Burgeon also hurts you if you're within the radius, and while it's not that much damage, it certainly adds up over a period of time, and Thoma's going to be able to protect you that via his pretty darn strong shields that you can also continually reapply. But also, because of the way his elemental burst works, and it has these slow hits of wide sweeping pyro damage, it's going to be able to burgeon very well, especially due to the fact that the internal cooldown on this elemental burst is not super short or anything. You're not going to be able to apply a ton of pyro aura with him, and that actually works to your advantage when it comes to burgeon specifically, because then you can focus on creating more Dendro cores to then activate said Burgeon reaction, while also protecting yourself and giving your teammates the extra Elemental Mastery and attack percent from that new set, making him a really strong and standout character for the different Dendro reactions that we've gotten here in 3.0. But not only is he really good for Burgeon, he's also really strong on different burning teams, and this is because if you're trying to do some normal burning shenanigans, you're going to be able to keep the pyro aura over the enemy very easily, even if you don't have good pyro application, and Thoma doesn't really have that good pyro application, but the burning aura really allows you to have good pyro application, and then you can swap to a strong, high scaling hydro unit, somebody like Yelan, and then just swap over and deal a huge amount of vaporized damage in one go there, which is phenomenal, and he's going to be really strong for that too. Alright, and yeah, arguably one of the most broken characters in the game did receive a buff from Dendro, and a lot of you might be scratching your heads and going, well, Animo and Dendro don't react. How did Kazuha get a buff from Dendro? Well, this guy can not only suck in the Dendro cores with his E skill, but do remember that this E skill does have elemental absorption. And if you absorb any element, which you're probably going to be doing because you're going to be swirling something, when you come back down and hit those Dendro cores or anybody applied with Dendro, you're gonna be doing that reaction. And oh, remember that Dendro scales well with Elemental Mastery, and this boy is built to the wazoo with Elemental Mastery most of the time. So yeah, he's really good with Dendro. Because not only can you control your Dendro cores for like a Bloom or Hyper Bloom team, you can also be the applier of other elements like Electro for your Hyper Bloom team, or Electro for your Aggravate team, even if you want, or Burgeon for your other Bloom reactions. He can do it all, and he's very good at it. But not only that, because he doesn't swirl Dendro, you can focus in whatever you want to buff with his Poetics of Fubutsu or the Viridescent Venerer set. Kazuha has always been an incredible unit, but Dendro has solidified him to be even stronger, and he's working extremely well with it. He can also, of course, get elemental absorption on the burst and activate anything there. And I don't think I mentioned this yet, but if you watched the previous video, you would know this, that Swirl can activate Dendro reactions. So if somebody has Dendro applied to them and you swirl another element nearby, and since he can't swirl Dendro, he's not going to swirl Dendro, he swirls another element nearby, the actual swirl damage, remember, is going to be the elemental type of whatever the swirl is. So if I swirl Pyro near a Dendro person, they're going to get the burning reaction, and guess whose elemental mastery that's going to check? You're right, this boy's, and that's an elemental mastery scaling reaction. So yeah, Kazuha is actually still ridiculous, and even more ridiculous with Dendro. Following the same kind of logic as Kazuha is somebody like Sayu, and while she isn't as potent of a character as somebody like Kazuha, she is going to be a really interesting example of this because she has always been a very good unit for Swirl because she has a very big AoE on her elemental burst here. She's also a solid healer and scales with elemental mastery, so she's always been very solid for swirling. But now with Dendro, since she has elemental absorption on this very long-lasting E skill, you can just keep circling around and applying whatever element you want to absorb to a bunch of different enemies and proc whatever Dendro reaction you want to have going on. So say you have Dendro Traveler's elemental burst going, you can absorb whatever element with her E skill and just keep applying it in circles and circles and swirling as much as you possibly want to keep applying said element, and then that reaction will check her elemental mastery similarly to Kazuha and allow you to deal really good reaction damage. So she's actually received quite an interesting buff from this, and I think you should be keeping an eye on her. And just as a brief honorable mention, Sucrose has also received a solid buff for the exact same reasons Kazuha has, except she's a little bit worse at it than Kazuha, but still very solid, and her elemental mastery bestowal to your teammates is not to be undervalued, especially with these Dendro reactions. Alright, back to Electro Baby, and Keqing has of course received an awesome buff from Dendro due to the Quicken and Aggravate reaction. She now has an amplifying reaction, and that's kind of what's just been missing for her the whole time, because Keqing has always been a pretty decent unit in the sense that she does a lot of pretty okay hits, and she's very consistent at it, and that's kind of been her thing. She can do a lot of electro application and do a lot of just very okay hits, but she was never doing very big numbers. A lot of her big numbers come from her charged attack because she has abnormally high scalars on her charged attack, And now she's just received a direct buff because she's going to have that amplifying reaction, meaning that these charge attacks are going to be dealing even more damage than they were previously. And she's also going to be a phenomenal unit for things like Hyper Bloom, where you can designate exactly where you want your AoE Electro to go with her E skill and apply it when you want. She's a very good Electro applier, and she has a lot of intentionality behind the way she actually applies Electro, meaning she's very strong for those Electro-based Dendro reactions. I did say that most of the Electro characters received a buff from Dendro, and I'm not joking. Like, pretty much all of them have received a buff, and pretty much all of them have received direct buffs to their kit and the way it worked fundamentally anyway from Dendro, and Raiden Shogun is no excuse for this one. This one is a little bit simpler because, as we know, Raiden Shogun doesn't really scale with Elemental Mastery or anything. She's an energy recharge scaling type of character, but the reason Raiden Shogun is so good is because she has phenomenal off-field Electro application, as she always has, due to the way her elemental skill works, because it lasts so long and deals really solid damage whenever you do any damage. But mostly she's received a buff in the sense that she has always been an absolute monster when it came to her elemental burst, especially if you have something like her C1 and C2 that increase her damage. She was already doing insane damage, and now she has an amplifying reaction on these insane scalers she had before anyway. Yeah, she's really strong, just pretty much for that reason solely. So Raiden Shogun is, yeah, she has an insane buff, and it's mostly because she has an amplifying reaction on one of the highest scaling elemental bursts like in the game, basically. And she was doing that without an amplifying reaction, and now she has one, so yeah, buff. All right, another reprieve from the Electro characters, and that's actually going to be Diluc, which is convenient because a lot of people probably got him his skin or something and they want to use it. And he actually has received an interesting buff from the Dendro element in the sense that we often were already building our Diluc with an Elemental Mastery main stat on the Sands, because this actually tends to be better on him for Vaporize reactions, especially if you have something like Wolf's Gravestone. If you're rocking Wolf's Gravestone, then you're definitely going to want something like an Elemental Mastery Sands to do the biggest Vaporize reactions. But now, since we were already building that Elemental Mastery into our Dilucs anyway, he's a phenomenal contender for things like Burgeon, or more specifically Burning. He's going to be a very strong burning character. So now we can continue to do the Vaporize shenanigans we were doing previously, but he's also going to allow you to have that sort of burning option whenever you're building his different teams, and I think that's pretty interesting. And I'm really excited to pair him with Cryo and Dendro specifically, because if you don't know, Cryo and Dendro can be applied to an enemy simultaneously, meaning that if you hit them with somebody like Diluc, he's going to be able to melt and burn them at the same time. So I'm very interested to pair him with some Cryo units and see how strong the melt slash burn team can actually be. I'm probably going to call it like Freezer Burn or something. I think that's a good team name. But I think there's a lot of potential behind it, and I think Diluc's going to be a phenomenal option for those kinds of teams. All right, only a couple more characters, I swear, and this one is pretty interesting. It's actually Razor. A lot of people have just kind of overlooked this, but it's for a similar reason that I was talking about Diluc, and not because we're building Razor with Elemental Mastery or anything, but because of the fact that Dendro and Cryo can be over an enemy at the same time. So with Razor specifically, you can not only quicken and aggravate now, you can also still get your Superconduct going simultaneously. So you can pair him with your favorite Cryo units like you were previously to deal the most physical damage you can, but also things like his Lightning Fang here, the elemental burst that he has, that deals electro damage anyway alongside his physical attacks, is also going to be able to aggravate now, getting that amplifying reaction. So that's really awesome. You're going to be able to superconduct like normal, but you're also getting the quicken and aggravate reaction, just adding free amplifying reactions to the damage he was going to be doing anyways. So that's really strong for him. His physical attacks or anything didn't get a direct increase there in damage, but his elemental skill, elemental burst, the electro damage on that has in one way or another, and I think that is very interesting for him, and I think he has a lot more potential now, and I'm really interested to try some different teams on him to get that superconduct and aggravate going. And then I also wanted to briefly talk about Lisa. Lisa is actually really cool with Dendro just because of the fact that her elemental burst does so many ticks of electro over its 15-second duration. It does a ton of those ticks, so she is phenomenal for applying electro for your Dendro reactions. And the main reason that I think she's really cool with Dendro is that she is one of the very few characters in the game that has an elemental mastery hidden ascension bonus. So yeah, like you'll see, I just have energy recharge here, and I don't know, this random artifact that gives me 58 elemental mastery, and this one gives me 42, so I'm getting like 90 elemental mastery there. But yeah, she has like 80 at base from her hidden ascension bonus there, so she's getting free elemental mastery, which is awesome. And you can obviously increase that with something like the brand new set that we mentioned before on Thoma. I think is going to be a really interesting option for her, because you're going to be able to build into that off-field attack percent and elemental mastery increase for your team. And she's also going to be getting extra elemental mastery and activating those different Dendro-related electro reactions. So I think you should definitely be looking out for her and potentially trying to build her. I'm definitely going to be messing around with some different Elisa teams myself. All right, and there's two more units I wanted to briefly mention. We're just going to talk about them a little bit because I'm going to talk about them in another video, but their usage for Dendro is really awesome, and I think they're quite good for it. And that is actually going to be Kamisato Ayato and Kokomi. And basically the reason Ayato's so good with Dendro, and it's more specifically he's good with the current Dendro characters we have, is because of his elemental burst. His elemental burst has a very long duration of 18 seconds, and it has a very big AoE. And when the Dendro Traveler's elemental burst comes in contact with Hydro, it also has a very big AoE, and it also gets a good duration. I believe you can get the same duration as Ayato's elemental burst, I believe. Don't quote me on that. I think it requires some constellations, but I believe that's the case. And if that's the case, those two together are phenomenal for a bloom-oriented team, whether it's Hyper Bloom or Burgeon or whatever. If you have both of those just using their elemental burst, that's going to do all the bloom you need, and I think he's really good for that. Likewise with somebody like Kokomi, who is a really good healer at base in general. We've already known that, but her E skill is very good for Dendro related reactions like Bloom, because every tick of the Kurage's Oath here actually applies Hydro, so it's very consistent Hydro application for those Bloom reactions. And I want to talk about more of them in depth in another video, because there is the new Hydro resonance, and that resonance is insane. It's really crazy, and we've got a lot to talk about there. But all the Hydro characters are pretty darn good with Dendro in general too, but I didn't think a lot of their kits directly received some sort of buff or, you know, reason to use them over anybody else for Dendro specifically, other than maybe these two for the reasons that I just mentioned. All right, well, I do believe that is going to be it for all of the characters that have received a buff from Dendro in one way or another. It was a lot of characters, I gotta admit, and yes, it was the majority of the Electro roster, I'm not going to lie, but all of their kits really do accent Dendro very well. And now that they have an amplifying reaction and usage for things like Hyper Bloom, that's a nice scaling reaction, they're all really, really good, and they're all interesting, and I'm very excited to be putting them in a bunch of different team compositions. Even the usage for the different Animo characters I think is pretty darn interesting. So yeah, I'm excited to try them all out. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Is there anybody that I didn't mention that you think I should have mentioned in this? As I said, I tried to stay focused towards the characters that, one, react with Dendro and received some sort of direct increase from the way Dendro works fundamentally. I was thinking about introducing some of the cryo characters, but I don't think they really fit because they don't directly react with Dendro. They're just more so helping Dendro and whatever unit wants to interact with both of those elements like we mentioned before. So let me know what you guys think about all of these characters that I mentioned in this video, any characters that you've been using and having a good time with them. But other than that, hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day. My name is Blossums, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.